Okay, how's that? Thank you, that's better. I'm really glad to have that introduction, actually, because if you looked at the listening material that was sent out and saw my picture, my hair was a very different color. This happened the night of the election. And well, it's getting whiter about a second. I'd like to introduce my really distinguished panel. I'm not sure how many people in the county know what incredible journalists we have working here, but you're going to find out tonight. To my left is Amy Wu. She is the political and government reporter for the Salinas Californian. She's worked at Time and the USA Today Network. She's written for the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. She spent 6 years working in Hong Kong, widely reporting within the Asia-Pacific region. She has extensive teaching and lecturing experience as well. She has her journalism degree from the Columbia School of Journalism. To her left is Sarah Rubin. Sarah Rubin is with the really successful Monterey County Weekly, in whose building we actually are tonight. She started with the Weekly in 2010 as a staff writer, and she's now the editor. Her writing has won numerous awards and has appeared in The Forward, Al Jazeera America, and The Atlantic.com. To her left is Royal Calkins. And if you know anything about Royal, you will appreciate what I'm about to read, because when I asked him for a brief bio, this is what he said. Probably should mention that I worked 40 years in the minor leagues of journalism. A couple of years as the editor of the Herald before being pushed out into cyberspace and the Monterey Bay Partisan. It was a GOP party hack who accurately described me once as, quote, a habitual troublemaker with delusions of relevance. Well, I'm here to tell you that Royal has incredible relevance. The Monterey Bay Partisan, which is his blog, is a very important instrument for us. It is one of the best places we have for public discourse, and I think he's created an amazing outlet. And if you haven't seen it, you should go online and do it as soon as we leave. So, without further ado, the plan for the evening is we're going to have a panel discussion. I know my panel is going to have a lot of ideas. We're going to talk first about the national scene, which I think we can all agree is a daily assault. And then we're going to talk about local news outlets and the effect that the national scene has had on it. And then we're going to have a Q&A session, and I'm really hoping that we're going to devote enough time to it so that you can come up here and offer your own questions to our panel. I'm sure there'll be a lot of them. So let's begin. I'm going to ask the first question, and then we'll take it from there. So we find ourselves in a media environment in which the President of the United States and his spokespeople demonize the press on a regular basis. I don't know if anybody saw the press briefing today, but the press briefing room at the White House was a literal war room. It was shameful. The administration makes false statements for which they have no proof, and then they challenge the media to provide the proof. They create continual confusion by throwing bombshells all over the place, multiple bombshells, and then reporters scatter and try to cover them, and they may not even last for one news cycle. Given the atmosphere in which journalism is operating today, I'm going to ask my panel how they think journalists can operate in this environment. Amy.
That's an excellent question. I did catch parts of the press conference today, indeed, with Sean Spicer and CNN. Well, we, the Salinas Californian, don't cover the White House, but we do cover City Hall and the Supervisor's Chamber. So we must continue to do our jobs, reporting factually, honestly, and without bias. I mean, if we fail to do that locally, I think we risk feeding the argument for those who believe the president's outlandish claims. You know, as a reporter, it's also to be on top of federal, state, regional, and local news development. And I think in a time of, you know, chaos, the great chaos of, you know, what's going on now in nationally, and anxiety and confusion, journalism as a profession, and journalists must focus especially on the nuts and bolts of our profession, presenting factual and solid reporting, and that aim to share a spectrum of viewpoints from all key stakeholders. So I really believe that.
Is that working? So, you know, it is an interesting question, I think, for three of us who are local journalists covering local issues, because we are not trying to get information from the White House and dealing with the obstruction that reporters there are facing. So, in a way, the effect I think that we experience is, you know, really a little bit abstract and maybe just tangential. The same sources that have been hard to get a straight story from before the election are still hard to get a straight story from now, and the people who are forthcoming are still forthcoming post-election who were pre-election, in my experience. But I do think, you know, it depends on the company. Sometimes you go to a cocktail party and it's popular to be a journalist, and sometimes it's not. And I think that's always been the case, but certainly now there's maybe a little bit more suspicion in some circles than there was before, and just a skepticism. But as far as how we do our job, and I think you will read this from White House reporters, that they will tell you they are doing their job the same way they always have done their job. Just because the president and his team are less forthcoming, they are still holding officials accountable in the same way they have before. They're not doing things differently. They're not doing things more negatively. They're not searching harder to unearth deep, dark secrets from his past. They are doing the same functions of journalism they've always done in the same way, just with perhaps more bizarre plot twists than anybody could have ever even anticipated a few months ago. And I think the same thing goes for us at the Weekly, that we are still doing the same kind of work we've always done. We did a lot of stories about what Obamacare was going to mean for our local hospitals. They were not all positive. And the effects of Obamacare here have not been all positive. Insurance rates in this county have they've soared, and it's been really hard on a lot of people. So we've done those stories. We will do stories about Trump care, and it may be good for some people. So we, I think, are responding to federal issues that affect us in the same way we did before, and we'll keep telling stories good and bad as we always have.
Well, actually, I think the national press is changing the way they're functioning. Most obviously, they had to kind of split off into two different groups of people covering the White House, and those are the breaking news people, and then the more investigative folks, because it didn't used to be that anybody cared how quickly the New York. When you're talking about scoops in the old days, it would be, you know, whether the Washington Post or the New York Times had it on Thursday or on Friday. Now it's who had it at 12:01, who had it at 12:02. So there's this rush to get, you know, the latest crazy, you know, Trump news out there, you know, the latest reaction. And so there's half of the press corps in Washington has become radio reporters covering, you know, the daily breaking churn. And you know, most of the significant press outlets like the Times, the Post, have also formed kind of special teams. And they are challenged by Trump. They do feel there's a bit of an ego battle going on. I have my best one good friend in the National Press Corps, named Jim Rice, and he was with the New York Times, and he won the People's Press several years ago for the first stories about the NSA wiretapping and you know, domestic wiretapping. And I don't know what he's working on right now, but he's done one story about the Trump administration that was about some guy out of banking that Trump was going to appoint to do some crazy mission. But he's been working on he and a team of people have been working on something else every day ever since then. I don't know what it is. But very fortunately, they are taking this very seriously. And some of the reporters, I think, are feeling very competitive. We have a crisis of leadership with the presidency, there is a bit of a race going on, and I think that's good. One piece of advice I think just to the readers is don't try to follow it all, it'll make you crazy. There's just way too much of it right now. There's too much news coming out. And do yourself clear when you're looking at like your Facebook feed, you see, this breaking story, this breaking story, this news here. If it's not somebody you really trust, the New York Times, Washington Post, Mother Jones, New Yorker, or somebody, ignore it. Don't read it. Don't read. You ever see the Bill Palmer report? Or there's a whole bunch of these. They're actually kind of fake news, and they're fake news both on the right and the left. Don't bother with them. If you don't recognize the people who are writing it, don't even read it because it's just going to confuse you. Because it's going to be 90% BS.
So I think, you obviously our two reporters here who are working at papers and don't have to deal with the tumult that happens every day in Washington. But as journalists, we're trained to deal with being able to sort out fact from fiction and fake news, which we'll cover in more detail later. But just to back up Royal's point, there's a very interesting study that came out of Harvard that looked at the news coverage over the 2016 election. And they found that Breitbart had an outsized impact on the mainstream media, and that actually the Breitbart story themes, which were largely about Trump's, quote, substantive proposals, were actually dominating the mainstream media news about Hillary, which actually focused on her emails and Clinton Foundation scandals, and really disadvantaged her. But I think Royal's point too is that you have to look for propaganda in the news because it can be interwoven with fact. And that's what makes it so dangerous. And that's what makes this administration so dangerous, because they're so adept at doing this. And it's very difficult, especially for online news consumers, to actually sort this out. So, having looked at that first question, let's go on to another one, which is, what should people expect from the press now? I mean, we have outlets that took a long time to call a lie a lie. The New York Times notably on them. The role of journalism is to put a spotlight on the powerful people in institutions. And how do you hold someone accountable who is actually untroubled by contradiction, loves chaos, will not back down from something that is demonstrably untrue? You can see that today. And who, confronted with the lack of facts, simply doubles down and then torments the press over trying to find the data which would contradict what is obviously a falsehood. As journalists, how do you handle
that? I think at our level, I can see this is certainly a historic time. In my lifetime, I haven't seen this yet, and I've been in the profession for now 24 years and counting. I don't know if that sheds light on my vintage or not. I've seen it go from, print, TV, and radio into what it is today. It's a fragmented media landscape. But anyway, I think at our level, can't allow ourselves to be distracted by the Trump playbook. We need to keep focused on what our local government leaders and establishments are doing or frankly not doing. I think the public should expect the press to tell the truth and focus on the facts at all times, but it is an interesting time because I think Royal mentioned social media and this explosion of these social media platforms, Facebook, the search engine, Google. Certainly this has just ignited over the past 7 years. When I was at Columbia, and this was not that long ago, the new media class was literally 7 people. And everybody else went to the print and the radio and the television. Sometimes I feel like this is surreal myself, but I think for our profession it's in many ways kind of almost, I hate to say this, but possibly a blessing as well, because I think now journalists bear more responsibility than ever to find the truth, to tell the truth. Increasingly, maybe our staff is changing as well. There are freelancers out there. There are newsrooms with you know, 3 or 4 or 5 people. There's community publications, but I think the digital aspects and the tools out there also allow for, you know, more, possibly you can collaborate with and use some of these tools to fact check, to be more responsible too. But I strongly believe that the press is responsibility. Your expectation as the audience or readers is always that a reporter, which I am, should be to focus on the facts and tell the truth, and to get as many aspects of viewpoints from the different key stakeholders, no matter what. I don't think it's an excuse to say that we don't have enough time, or, you know, geez, we're overstretched, which we are, but I strongly believe in that, which is why I'm still in this profession after a quarter of a century.
Yeah, I agree with so much of what Amy said. And I think back to Susan's question about accountability and officials, that there's certainly a degree to which the press is, you know, perhaps trying to influence or change behavior of public officials when they are clearly deceiving the public or doing something that is undisputably wrong. But largely we are talking to the public, not to the officials. They are members of the public, of course, but it is not the role of the press, in my view, to get Trump to change his behavior. That is the role of his voters. And so by reaching his voters, the press certainly has a role in that, but it, you know, will be the next election that really decides how he's doing at his job. And in the intervening years, obviously, there's a lot that can be done. You see this massive rising resistance movement that, you know, in my lifetime is unprecedented as far as organization. It's a little bit messy, but just the numbers are staggering. And I think locally too, we are not just writing to members of Salinas City Council or Monterey City Council, we are writing to their constituents, telling them this issue may matter to you, and if you care, you should show up at this meeting and you should speak, and they will respond to you. And you know, our mission is different than trying to change things on a national scale. It is trying to influence things locally. And I may be a little bit too cynical about what happens nationally. I think you can send 1,000,001 postcards to Trump and his administration and they won't care. They think they have a mandate, but you can go have coffee with your mayor. They will sit down with you face to face, most likely, or your county supervisor, and you can tell them about the potholes on your street, or the policies you would like to change, or the presence of immigration officials in your county jail. And if you don't like what they do, you can mount a recall campaign, you can run yourself. There are things that you can do as the public that are so immediate on this local level, that is the level we are watching and we are covering, that to me is a really thrilling thing about local media. You can actually see it in action. It's not these really big, slow-moving changes. It's pretty instantaneous, and there's a very obvious kind of call and response thing that happens. And when it doesn't happen, people lose elections, and that's very real. So to me, that's kind of conversation we're having with our readers is not the people who are the shot callers, but the people who are holding those shot callers accountable.
We go on the national level. I think we're seeing a sea change in journalism that even journalists haven't quite figured out yet. And that is, most of my career in journalism was most of my reporting was at the Fresno Bee, and a lot of the blame for the sort of the demise of digital journalism goes to Craigslist. They took all the advertising away. I think even a bigger factor was the bland he said, she said treatment that the local newspapers have engaged in for the last, for most of the last 40 years. No analysis, no fact finding, just like he said, she said. Unfortunately, I was more of the kind of guy who wanted to get into the, what's the truth here, but I was a little either before my time or behind my time or the other. But we, in large part, because of Trump's election and the whole Trump's ability to manipulate the press and get everything, get his message out so well every day, sort of unchallenged because it was so entertaining. He'd say some nonsense and it would get on TV, no matter what it was. And a lot of people got upset with the press for why are you letting them get away with this? Well, it's an team. They really kind of didn't have a choice. You know, presidential candidate says outrageous. You know, the sky is falling, and we'll all die tomorrow. How are you not going to report that? Well, because the press kind of got embarrassed by what happened. Now there's been this sort of unleashing of it's time to call. You know, time to say they're lying. This is a lie. It's not truthful. Well, the rules have changed really dramatically just since the inauguration, and just in the last couple of months, things have really changed. And I don't understand it yet. The rules are going to be, everything's going to be different. And eventually, it's going to trickle down to local. I think perhaps it'll be better. Perhaps it'll be a good thing. Perhaps it'll be a horrible thing because we're sort of unobjectifying the news. We're going to make it more subjective. The news coverage more subjective. It could get us closer to the truth, but also could get us into a lot of real danger with, especially we were talking earlier about all the different press, all the stories you can't keep up with. One of the concerns that Susan's had a lot of times is the tribalism of news. Instead of 3 or 4 major news sources, now we've got 50 minor news sources. But there's a change going on right now that it's important that you watch it and try to understand it and see how it affects you. But it's going to take some analysis on readers' parts to decide whether we want to live with this or not.
Well, that was the point I was really trying to get to, was to lift ourselves from the local scene and look and judge to see how the national press is handling this. I mean, we have the issue of, we keep talking about, it's the responsibility of journalism to get to the truth. But the fact is that there are different facts, and that there are people who live in these alternative fact universes that you can't persuade. And when you don't have facts that you can agree on, you can't act on them. And it really is a danger to democracy. So if we don't understand what the mechanism of this is, as Royal points out, we do understand the effect. And the effect is that people in this country who are not politically savvy, very confused, and certainly not media literate, will go for the alternative universe. And that is really what is at the base of this issue. And to me, that is what is really a problem. And so my next question to you is, how do you think the press is handling it right now? I mean, if you divide the world into what I call the legitimate media versus the, I guess it's the right-wing media, and how they're handling this, what kind of grade do you give to the legitimate media? What kind of grade do you give to the New York Times? Is the media normalizing the behavior that we see on a national level?
Well, again, I think they're sort of on probation because things have changed. We don't really know how they're doing it. I think they've stepped up pretty nicely against, I think, the national press is embarrassed by the election, and so they're stepping up and they're trying to do a particularly good job of digging. And again, so there sort of is a contest, I think, between the Trump administration and the press. But the press is used to losing, and we don't mind being vilified. We never have been. But some of the things going on right now, they're just so they so defy the rules we're used to. I mean, what's this? Tillerson goes to China and he takes this one guy that he selects from some business journal or whatever. He's the only reporter. The same business journal editorialized today about how suggesting that the judge in Hawaii overturned the travel ban because Obama was in Hawaii the other day. I mean, this stuff is just so Looney Tunes. I think the press is going pretty well at the national level. However, I do worry. I was talking earlier about how they're having to do the AP, the Wire report, the daily broadcast report covering the quick breaking news. Plus, they have to do the digging, so they're going to be pretty strained. It's going to be they're going to have a hard time keeping up. There's a lot of effort. Don't get me started on the resources available to the local press because that's a whole different conversation. conversation. But the national press right now is putting themselves pretty nicely, but they're working their tails off to do it. I don't know how long they can keep it up.
Yeah, I think the national press is doing an excellent job of covering so much of what's happening, but if anything, I think it's too fast-paced, and I don't have time to read all the incremental updates about, you know, the back and forth and the allegation about Obama being in Hawaii, and that I didn't even hear that until right now. Because I'm busy reading the Best of Monterey County issue that comes out on Thursday, and reading about, you know, like where to get the best burger and the best milkshake. And that is my priority right now, not even, you know, healthcare in Monterey County or short-term rentals coming to the Planning Commission, which are probably the things that I should be focused on. But these things are all in competition all the time. And so I guess, if anything, to me, I feel like there is so much emphasis on all of the constant incremental reporting of what's coming out of the White House and the responses to that, that all of the bandwidth that the press is putting into those stories is bandwidth that they are not allocating to other stories that are also so critical internationally, and weather and climate change, and the stories that our readers really care about right now mostly have to do with weather and roads. And if we don't tell those stories, you know, the collective we and Bianca, you know, nobody will know about it. And if the national press, you know, they're all in competition with each other the way we're all in competition with each other, so they will all do the same stories. But I am not even going to read any stories except on maybe a 24-hour cycle about the latest on what's coming out of the White House. So when there are hundreds of stories a day out from every news outlet, it makes me nervous, I guess, that they are not covering other things. So much of news decisions are what gets space and what doesn't get space in any given issue. And we at the Weekly have unlimited space online, but we have very limited space in print. And we also don't have just the human capacity to write everything we want to write on our website either. So if we keep chasing some story, it means that we are ignoring other things. So I guess this is a long way of saying I worry that perhaps that this temptation that I feel as a reader too, I want to read all the Trump news, I just can't, but I know that I am ignoring, as a reader of national news, important stories, and I worry that the press that is consumed by that is also missing important stories that I should know about. And I don't know the best way to resolve that. It's like the shiny thing, and it's, you know, reporters are bulldogs. It's kind of part of the DNA, and it is fun to, I would imagine that if you were a reporter in Washington, it would be fun to keep reporting on what's happening there every day. It would be exhausting, but thrilling. So I don't blame them.
I don't want to digress too much. I agree with a lot of what Sarah's saying. I mean, there is so much out there on any given day. My focus and actually my passion is community news, and primarily Salinas, actually. Less so the peninsula these days, primarily Salinas. So on any given day, I'm kind of looking at what our community is interested in, which are potholes and sidewalks, and what's going on with the school bonds, the raise in taxes, what is impacting their lives and at this level. But what has changed is perhaps some of what has drawn me maybe to more of the national coverage is our issues, such as immigration has been tremendous. For the past month in Salinas, it's just, we have a huge population, as you know, of migrant workers. The ag industry is huge there, a $9 billion industry with global impact, actually. I think 80% of the leafy greens are actually grown in Salinas Valley and Salinas. So it's amazing. It's great in a way because you can look at the big issues up there, like Trump's executive orders and his bans on that, and see the trickle-down effects to a community. The fears, the anxiety. When I go to the immigration forums, which there'll be another one on Monday, which I will attend, And somebody recently said, why are you attending all of them? You know, it's just the same issues again and again and again, and aren't you going to be writing the same story? I highly disagree. I make it a point to be there and to sit through the whole thing, because I want to talk to the people. I also want to not just talk to the officials and get the official point of view, and that's important as well, but I believe in diversifying your sources, and I don't speak Spanish, I speak Chinese, probably the wrong language, but you know, I feel like people can tell, the sources can tell if you're sincere and you really want to hear their story. So I do see the national issues are impacting the local communities, and I'm also very much focused on that, but I'm always fascinated as to how different publications cover the same kind of story. So I myself, it's hard. We only have 24 hours, but I try to diversify the news sources or news diet that I have. I make it a point to see if I can look at the Times and also maybe MSNBC, NBC, but also look on the other side and look at the Wall Street Journal and Fox News. But I think I'm also coming from it from the point of a journalist. I'm curious to see what the coverage of the same topic is. So
I don't look at Fox News. I'd like to pick up on something that Sarah said, because I think it's really important. There are stories that are being missed. There are things we need to know that in the slush of things coming out of Washington we miss. I know I put myself in a diet, actually. I think I'd slash my wrists if I read everything that I used to read. And I come at this from kind of the 30,000 foot level, kind of at like a First Amendment, free press kind of view. I'd like to say to you that there is some activism that can be done. It's not just limited to getting to your members of Congress or your local representatives to see the stories you want. You can write to editors, you can publish letters to the editors, you can write commentaries, you can bring notice to the kinds of issues that you want. And when you see the press doing something really horrible, you can write to the people who own those outlets. And I encourage you to do that. And on to the next question. One thing that has really bothered me, and this again is the 30,000 foot level thing, is for the press to be called the enemy of the people, to be called the opposition party. Now, I realize this is the Bannon-Trump strategy, and they have the bully pulpit, and they can really use it, and they have, to arouse enmity against the press. So I'm going to ask my journalist panel, beginning with Royal, do you think this is a time now for there to be more activist journalism in the sense that the point of view of the author should be more pronounced in stories?
Well, I'm not sure. It sort of goes back to what I was talking about before. You know, whether, you know, to what degree do we want, you know, subjectivity in our news coverage, and what degree do we want objectivity? I think the press, some elements of the press are fighting back with this enemy of the people thing. Some publications did a nice thing. They did little profiles of the Washington Bureau, you know, showing that they're all pretty much corn-fed, you know, Iowa people who went to church. There was a major study, I think, by the Pew Center 20 years ago of investigative reporters, and found that they were remarkably traditional people. That they respected the community. They respected rules. They wanted the rules to be followed. That their motivation was they wanted to expose unfairness when the playing field was unlevel, and they weren't bomb throwers. They were kind of Hubert Humphrey Democrats. They were mild people who wanted to follow the rules. So as far as getting more personality or more perspective into the news, I don't know if it's a good idea. I think locally, it probably is a good idea, because to go back to one of my themes about the lack of resources for newspapers, if we don't have more explanatory journalism at the local level, I think we're really going to be harmed, because the news desk have gotten so small now that they don't have the ability to give you just the volume of information you need to make your own decisions. If they don't dig in and do some explaining at a local level, you're going to be lost.
I think it's a good question, and it's something that I've read about and heard about lately, this idea that, you know, everybody has some bias, right? That how much do you, I guess, cop to it in your journalism and expose what your stake is in the issue. And it's with everything, right? It's like you're a homeowner or you're a renter, so you have certain biases around, you know, zoning issues and things that affect the value of homes in your neighborhood. We live here and we work here, so we all care in different ways about different things that we cover. But we are not writing about ourselves and our views. Certainly, just as curators of the ideas that we write about, our ideas, I think, are very present in our newspaper. But our task is really to reach out to people in the community and tell their stories. So I think the thing that I encourage writers at the Weekly to do is when you're working on a story, particularly a long form cover story when you have the luxury of a little bit more time, you just go to all the sources you can possibly think of and you ask them, what is the story? And hear from them what it is. And I'm a lot less interested in what my reporter thinks the story is than what all these other people do. And then their job really is to distill all those interpretations of all the people who are affected, and they become perhaps one of the many people, right? Maybe they are a cyclist, and so they really care about what happens with the bike lane striping project on whatever street. But that's not the story that we are tasked to write, and that's not the story that our readers want to read. Otherwise, you can read a newsletter from a bike association that has an agenda that they are advocating for, and that is distinctly not our job. We are doing something that is a very different approach to trying to get at the truth of the matter, and it by definition involves finding diversity of views. At the same time, back to what Royal said earlier, we are not trying to do the he said, she said kind of approach and just say, here's what all the disagreement is. We are trying to get real reportable data and facts and some analysis to help interpret what's happening. And some of that, of course, is filtered through us, but that still I don't think is the most interesting or most important angle of any story for us to tell.
I agree with a lot of what Sarah just said. I believe our job as journalists is to tell the facts, and the consumer should decide. I mean, my job is not to change people's beliefs as well, and people hear what they want to hear anyway, you know. I think it is to bring the facts, and it is more challenging than ever. I mean, Royal brought something up about the perhaps shrinking newsrooms, and I won't dispute it. You know, over the years I've seen the newsrooms and resources shrink. I've seen the number of newsroom folks go down. However, I believe it's not just a time to kind of take a step back and be like, well, you know, what can we do about this? But there's a chance of opportunity. I think it's thinking out of the box. For example, at the Californian, in the very short time I've been there for about a year, we have done exploratory and explanatory journalism. We did a 7-month investigative series looking at Prop 47 prison reform locally. What we did was we teamed up with other journalists in our network, other California papers, and we got together and we split the reporting. We got the documents from all of the counties in California. So it's collaborating and finding new ways to work together to maybe do that investigative story. There's opportunities in looking more in depth at issues such as agriculture by another model that's worked, and the Californian has been very open to this, is that using perhaps the grant structure and working with places such as the ICFJ to pursue in-depth stories about women in agriculture. So what I'm saying is that no doubt, we're busier than ever. We're all overstretched, not just our industry. Every industry is overstretched, and we are busier than ever. But there are opportunities there. I see it as actually a positive. There's a Chinese word for danger, and it actually is a combination of crisis and opportunity. So I do see a slant of sun in that as well.
Susan, can I jump in for a second? I wanted to expound on something you said. I don't want to let it slip away. She was talking about things that we all can do, writing commentaries and other things. I think it's critical for the community to step up and to be some community journalism. Again, I don't want to beat a dead horse about the resources, but the newspaper, I'll give you one statistic. When I started at the Monterey Herald, there were 48 people in the newsroom. Now there's 9. So there's some pretty dramatic change. But I look around the room and I see some of my favorite reporters, like Julie Engel up there, and George Riley, and other people who have written some very important news, both when I was at the Herald and at the Partisan. And there are people, I think the people in the community are going to, just as self-defense, are going to need to step up and help expose some problems or expound upon things. One of my favorite parts about my blog, the website, the Monterey Bay Partisan, is we feature comments from people, and usually the comments are far better than the articles. I learn a lot more. Almost always the people who write the comments actually know what they're talking about, as opposed to this guy. So it's something I've been pushing forever, is getting more community involvement in the website, but also in the newspapers. The Herald has gone to, on Sundays, they have space for like 5 commentaries. It's extremely well read. I mean, if you got a point of view, if you got a problem, that's free space for you to get 20, 30,000 people reading about it. Take advantage of it.
I'm just curious. Oops. Here we go. I'll never learn how to use a microphone. I'm just curious, how many people in the audience subscribe to a local newspaper? Oh my, that's quite a few. Because when you hear about the dwindling subscribers, it's really disheartening. I'm including actually the Partisan in this because I think of it as being. Well, yeah, the weekly is the weekly, and we'll talk about that. The weekly has a very unique role in this community, but I love hearing these reporters talk about how they function in their jobs here and how hard they work. And I keep trying to get them back to the national level, because that's where my concern is. I think journalism is fine in our parts. Where I think it's really in trouble is on the national level. So let's talk about the third rail. Let's talk about social media. Because I would say probably that in a certain demographic, in that demographic, most people receive their news on Facebook. And as you know, Facebook has had an ever-changing algorithm when it comes to what they regard as real news. We still don't know how they sort it out, but social media has really fueled the partisan silos in which people operate. And I'm wondering if our panel has views on how we can ever get out of these silos, and how it is that we ever can get back to an agreement on what reality is.
I think we're doomed. No, I mean, really, we're so fragmented, and there's so much stuff out there you can't keep track of it. I think Facebook, as much as all sorts of other issues, I think Facebook had a lot to do with Hillary Clinton losing, because there was so much propaganda spread there. There were other factors, of course, but I don't know. I share your concern. I certainly don't have a solution.
I know that this phenomenon exists clearly, but I don't find it difficult to distinguish between what is vetted, legitimate journalism and fake news. To me, it seems so clear, and clearly that's not fair. I mean, this whole room is a very self-selected crowd, so that number of you who subscribe to local newspapers, I think, is not representative of the community you're choosing to spend your Thursday night out talking about journalism, so not representational at all. But I'm so glad you're here, because this is what I talk about all the time. This is what I would be talking about wherever I was. But I think there is some lack of media literacy. I don't know where it should come from. And and where it's not, and where perhaps it once did. I know that when I was a kid, we did current events at school where we would cut out newspaper articles and explain them, and I found that to be an incredibly tedious, boring exercise. I grew up to become a news person, so it didn't do anything for me. You know, the way I learned about it in school, I don't think had any positive influence or lasting influence on me, and I hated it. It's just an activity I remember as being dry and terrible. So I would not credit my otherwise really wonderful public school education with getting me to be good at interpreting news and appreciating news and distinguishing between fact and alternative fact. So I don't see educationally what is the best way to, you know, revisit media literacy, but clearly we've got to do something. But I guess, you know, ultimately it's a consumer product, right? People are going to read the stuff they want to read. They're going to subscribe to what they want to subscribe to. And there have always been outlets that lean one way or another. All these magazines that are still beautiful, glossy, thick national magazines were, you know, like The Atlantic was this strongly abolitionist magazine. They had a slant, and so if you disagreed with their politics, you probably didn't read them. And so there's always been some, you know, this is speculation, I wasn't around then obviously, but I think there's probably always been some siloing, and I think it feels magnified now because there's so much of it and it's so constant, but I remain unconvinced that it's a wholly different environment in that regard. And you start to hear about all this social science about how when you hear facts or read facts that reinforce your beliefs, that, you know, I'm not even going to try and talk about the science of it, but that it is detectable in your brain, that you respond differently to things that support your beliefs or don't. And so there's no way that that's new, right? That's always been that way. That's how our brains are actually built. So, you know, I think also in a weird way, I've been heartened to see how much hate mail we get at the Weekly, because it means that a lot of people who don't agree with us are reading our paper and feel compelled to write in and tell us that. And then I publish what they have to say. And so they are talking in the letter section both to the people who agree with them and the people who don't. And so my perception is that I am not just preaching to a choir in the Weekly, and there are a lot of people who tell us every week they're never going to read the paper again, and then they tell me the next week they're never going to read the paper again. And they still do. Maybe some of them, some of my regular letter writers have fallen off. If you're watching the live stream, I would love to hear from you again. But I guess, I mean, I do hear the doom and gloom, but I'm not convinced it's as bad as we all think it is, and I think that it's, you know, regular old people have the ability to just start reading good stuff. I don't know that it is our responsibility as news people to do it differently.
I love the optimism of youth. Okay, I'm going to switch topics completely. This is a topic that I know this particular audience is interested in, and I'm not going to let you get away without addressing it. And that's gender bias in the media. I suppose, of course, the latest example of that would be Hillary Clinton, and how there was never an article about her that didn't remark on her dress or her hair. Recently, Kellyanne Conway, one of our favorite people, was also treated the same way when her appearance was criticized more than once. And the latest I read about was Amal Clooney, who gave a significant address at the UN imploring Iraq to prosecute the crimes of ISIS in the International Criminal Courts. And most of the news coverage was about her dress and the fact that she was wearing 4.5-inch heels. I saw today that the Columbia Journalism Review came out with new rules on how people should cover women in the media. So I know that we've got a couple people on this panel who've actually studied this issue. And so I'm going to hand the microphone to one of them.
Yeah, it's a topic of interest to me. I actually did a study using semiotics, which is using, I see some heads nodding here, that's amazing. It's like nobody knows what's going on. It's a tool where you use that to use visuals and kind of see what the visual is and what meaning comes through from it. So I looked at Time Magazine's covers of Hillary Clinton, and through their coverage and so forth. I'm not going to talk too much about that study, but I did want to add some comments here. Is that I think that gender bias has been existing since the beginning of journalism, and we've made progress compared to like a century ago. But are we gender bias free now? Not at all. And I think that what can be done about that is, there are organizations of journalists like the JAWS. It sounds like it's something like a shark-related thing, but it's the Journalism Association for Women's Symposium, and it's a pretty strong organization. They have a growing number of members. They have an annual conference. There's a lot of editors and reporters that are a part of this, and we get together, we mentor, we actually try to help and other women. And I think that's important because I do believe in that. I think it starts from the ground up, and it starts with helping a younger woman, maybe who's interested in writing and reporting and getting into the industry, and so forth. But no doubt, I see this all the time. Like when Hillary Clinton used her personal emailing device for official work during her stint as the Secretary of State, she was repeatedly vilified. I thought, and threatened during the campaign of arrest. But then just a couple of weeks earlier, it was reported, I don't know if you all saw that, but Mike Pence was using his personal AOL account as the Indiana governor to do safe business. And I thought there were some fleeting reports, but I didn't see the extent of the reporting of what it was for Hillary. There was no discussion or question of accountability for that. And then, so I think women in public life are more often judged by different standards. I saw a documentary called Misrepresentation, where Nancy Pelosi talked about how the journalists were more concerned about what would happen to her children, who were all adults, and after she was elected for the first time. So I think, I still see it, it's pretty prevalent, but maybe, with the next generation it will change, but it is pretty serious.
Yeah, I think there's so clearly so much gender bias in the world writ large that we see certainly in the media. And, one thing that we try to do is just to be attentive to the representation of, in simple numbers terms, how many men, how many women, how many people of color. And there's, it's an interesting thing looking at our paper and realizing, maybe for a few weeks in a row in our face-to-face section in the front of the book, where we do a Q&A with somebody who's an interesting member of the community, we've had a bunch of white men in a row. And it's something that we try to avoid because there's no reason for that. It's interesting people. And there is reason where perhaps you end up with a news section that relies really heavily or entirely on quoting white men, because they are more likely to be the mayors of the cities that you're writing about. They are more likely to be the public works directors. They are more likely to be the finance directors. So all the people that you might call for a news story are, because of the gender biased world that we live in, likely to skew racially and gender-wise in that direction. So not that that's an excuse, but not a good excuse, but it is the excuse for why you might see that kind of weighting in certain kinds of stories, even food stories. We did a cover story about women breaking out in the wine world, but they are still relatively few. So when we write about wine, we are a lot more likely to quote men and write about men than we are about women, because of their representation in that industry. And we as journalists cannot change that representation. Some city councils are all men. So even if you want to call the member of council who is a woman, you can't, because she doesn't exist. So if your job is to, report on what's happening on these various bodies, you're left with who you have to talk to. But then, particularly in sections that are features, I mean, this week is a terrible example. Our 831, our feature story, is about the public works crew in Monterey and how busy they've been fixing potholes. It's a great story. It's by a new intern who did a beautiful job, and it was a really fun story for her. I loved editing it. She loved working on it. But of course, all the guys on the crew are guys. And that is what you might expect. But it means that we're attentive to that. Next week we will have an 831 that is about a woman in business who has a really cool business. And you have to pick up the issue and find out what it is.
Can I speak too? It's all about hiring. I mean, I've been in the business long enough. You know, when I started as a reporter, there weren't any women in the newsroom. Of course, I think back then women couldn't vote either. I'm not sure, but it's been a long time ago. But newsrooms were so male-dominated, and management still is. But things did improve. I've watched 4 years of improvement. I'm not saying we made great progress and leave us alone. I mean, it's still pretty horrible, but it really has changed dramatically. I do remember one of the times I was most appalled was in the 1980s. I was at the Fresno Bee, and top management didn't see anything wrong with. There's a feature story I did about getting Eddie managed about the new Miss California who was from Merced, and his lead was when she talks, she's charming. When she walks, she's alarming. And they thought that was fine. But it's all about hiring. When I was at the Santa Cruz Sentinel, the news meetings at 4 o'clock every day, most newsrooms have a meeting to decide what's going on the front page. And the meetings have been, at the Santa Cruz paper had been so dominated by men for so long that they had a new rule that they used the night reporter would join the meeting, because the night reporter, the most recent hired person, would always be a woman. That way they could have some representation. So it's all about the hiring. Men are not going to change unless they have to, because the women around them make them.
That's right. For the men are here to be better minds. So that's absolutely true. I mean, the newsrooms are dominant male, and of course management is. The New York Times, which you probably know has a public editor, just a week ago or so did an appraisal of the Times newsroom and said it was dismal, that they didn't have nearly enough women. And I should be really bitter, but I'm not. When I got out of journalism school, the New York Times would not hire women at all. I mean, you couldn't get a job running copy around the office. You had to go to some place small, like in Arkansas, and work for a small paper, and then somehow make your way back to the big city newspaper, and that remained that way for a long time. But I'm not bitter. I wound up in a found place, which is here. Okay, it's your turn. We want to hear from you. We'd like to take questions from the audience now. We assume that you've been thinking, deliberating, formulating your opinions and questions. So, Regina, you can only do this with a microphone. I'm sorry to tell you this. We won't be able to hear you if you don't use the mic. So you need to step up.
Fran, I think you have a question?
I want to address a couple of points. I think it's important to notice there's a big difference between helping women become journalists and journalists reporting on how women are performing in the public eye. And it sounds like those are a little mixed up. As in one issue, it's not, it's two. And I also think it's very important to talk about why the news media select particular things to report and not others. And it seems to me, as not a journalist, just a reader of a few of the publications you've mentioned, that the news media is following Trump's agenda. That he brings a little fire here, and everybody goes and reports on it, and then he makes another one because that was getting a little out of control, and everyone goes and reports on that. So if we're looking at the New York Times newsfeed, and I get a daily newsfeed like probably most people in this room, I'm looking at the fires, but I, for example, don't see very much about the Russia connection, which I think is probably underlying one of the most important things that should come out of the election process and what's going on with the government. I'm worried about that. So how do we do the selection of what we're going to report to everybody? That's a pretty important thing.
Well, I'm going to let our pros here answer that, but I do want to make a point about this following Trump around. I think that's really happening a little bit less. There are people who are ignoring his tweets now and looking at what he does. But it is very definitely his mode, and you're right, with the blurring of news and entertainment, the entertainment is going to be followed. But let me hear from
Well, I can't speak too much again about Trump because I'm not part of the Washington press corps and so forth, but I can talk about a little bit about the profession and the curation of news and so forth. It's true, you know, we can't cover everything, you know. I mean, maybe there was a time when, I remember a time actually when there were at least everybody was a beat reporter. You had one reporter in one town, and you know, one reporter, one police reporter. But things have changed, and there's a lot more responsibility on journalists to know their community and their readers and the audience and what's out there, which is why I almost feel like we have to take a step back and go back to the old shoe and leather journalism almost, and not practice what I call clip and Google it journalism, you know, sitting at one's desk and kind of just regurgitating or linking to other people's stories, aggregating all of this, and also kind of just being lazy, and frankly, I mean, I hate using that word, you know, but it's true. Not getting out to the community. The way that I can speak for what I try to do is to go to as many meetings physically as possible, whether it be city council, or the county supervisors, or the community groups that hold their meetings. Maybe it could be the LULAC or the Chinese American group or so forth. We have to be strategic about this. I believe it can be done just by physically showing up and sitting through the whole meeting and not just talking to the officials and getting to know them, but really kind of just even sitting in the audience and turning over and saying, hey, you know, who are you? You know, I'm so-and-so. It sounds very old-fashioned in a way, but I truly believe it's starting there, and then you kind of, from the ground up, kind of learn a little bit more about the community. I try to walk the streets sometimes of Old Town Salinas, and that's what I try to do. But no, we can't cover every story. Our education in Salinas is tremendously important, and we have a lot of districts, and there are a lot of amazing stories there. Sometimes it's trying to telling stories in a different way. Maybe it's, you know, with technology, it's creating a documentary, like a mini documentary or a photo gallery, or thinking of out of the box. That's how I try to approach it. It's a little bit experimental, maybe it's innovative, maybe it's becoming entrepreneurial. Our industry, frankly, is changing through rapidly changing times and technology. So, but I strongly believe that this is, in this time of change, there is also some opportunity in that.
Yeah, just as far as, I love what Amy said about that. I just want to say I think that's so crucial. And we have this idea at the Weekly that you should go have coffee once a week with somebody that you have never met before and just talk to them and find out what their story ideas are. And by widening the base of your sources and the people you know, you will have more pluralistic story pitches, and you will be able to come. We have a Wednesday news meeting every week, and then if you keep pitching stories from the same few sources, you are not doing a good job developing sources, which really in a lot of ways is the primary task of a news reporter, is meeting people who know what's happening in their community, and everybody knows what's happening in their community, just in a different way. They're not all people who go to public meetings or serve on public boards. They may simply be a person who lives there and can tell you what it feels like with fears about immigration, or with rising gang violence, or whatever maybe is happening, or good things too, right? Maybe they have kids in the school and they love the Common Core. Whatever it may be, all of these people can bring the story to you, and then reporters come to our Wednesday, we're weekly, so we do this just once a week, and they pitch their stories, and they basically make the case for this is why this is the most interesting and important story this week, and this is why it must run next Thursday. So they're pitching a story that will publish 8 days away. And then I hear all their pitches and decide what makes the cut and what doesn't. And some of it will wind up on our blog. which I hope you all read. And some of it will go nowhere. Some of it might wind up as a tiny write-up as the good week or the bad week. And some of it maybe we'll just tweet it and say that that's enough coverage of that topic. So where we decide this is actually a really big story, we're going to do a cover story about it a month from now. It's not going to run next week. So it's a combination of all these things. You know, we might have held, well, we couldn't have held it because the pine cone comes out tonight. Royal got a scoop today about Rob Mullane, the city of Carmel, resigning tomorrow. And then we had to chase you because you got that. So we had to post it right away. And then the pine cone will have it in tomorrow's paper that comes out online tonight. So, you know, we're all doing that whole fast-paced thing too.
So are you accusing me of writing a story only to scoop the pine cone? It's good. I might plead guilty to that, but I don't know.
There is little in this world that is so satisfying as scooping a pine cone.
I want to get back to your question real quick. I don't think the press has a choice. You can't, if Trump stands up and says, you know, I ate a dog for lunch, you know, it has to be reported. I think too many people are thinking that the press is like stupidly not realizing that it's being distracted from other issues. People who run the New York Times and the Washington Post, they get it. They understand that this is ban and misdirection, and they're doing a great job of it. But nobody's being totally misdirected. They might have to put some resources on covering the stupid thing Trump said today, but nobody's taking the focus off the Russian connection or today it's okay to get rid of Meals on Wheels. It'll be compassionate to get rid of Meals on Wheels. I mean, nobody's taking the eye off the ball just because they're distracting us.
Okay, we have a question. We have a question here.
George, do you have a question?
This looks like George Riley, the most knowledgeable man in the world when it comes to water.
We may have a story for you soon. My question is not about water, but if the resources on journalism is so restricted or less than it used to be, what are the possibilities of picking up a story from another paper, whether it's just another source, like one of you right here, and repeating or summarizing some of that story as your own, so you get the story out, but you also get your name out, and you also get your publication reading and other types of stuff. It's not just from the community, it's from each other. So when you make a major story and you do something, like we just said just now, it's not just breaking news. It's some of the analytical stuff, or the background stuff, or the stuff that's connected. It's really not news, but it's news to people who are interested in that subject. So you may be a little more depth or a little more detail, but it comes from another source. It comes from the Californian to the Weekly, or it goes from the Weekly to Royal, or even to the Pine Cone. But what's wrong with that model?
Oh, no,
What's wrong with my question?
We're competitors.
Ego.
I know, that's my point.
Yeah, the ego's important. Some of it you can't. There are legal reasons, like the Herald can't pick up a story from California. I mean, there's copyright issues and there's even restrained trade issues. The Herald would have gone to California or vice versa years ago if it wasn't a Department of Justice restrained trade issue. It certainly can be. I started the partisan in part to try to. I started as a supplement to local news, and as I was leaving the Herald and watching the Dimension press corps, I thought, well, maybe I can help by supplementing things a little bit. And also, I figured I have a lot of experience covering elections. Maybe I could write enough about elections that would fortify young reporters elsewhere to write more about what these culprits really, what these bastards are really doing than once we're running in office. It didn't work. I haven't read my stories, and nobody else would pick it up because of for competitive reasons. We should share more than we do. I say we. I'm glad to plug other people because I don't really have an ego. I don't really have a horse in the fight commercially. So Sarah, why don't you pick up Harold stories?
Well, we certainly read what all the other local media is doing. And, I mean, the Weekly's a little bit of a different animal. We certainly feel like we operate as a daily newspaper to some degree on our website. But even there, sometimes we'll decide, you know what, not our story, we're not going to get it first, so let's just wait. And I sometimes wonder wonder how much readers even notice or care about who gets it first. I think that is really an ego-driven thing. Probably none of you would have noticed that Royal got that Cardinal City Hall story unless I told you. But he deserves credit where credit's due. We are racing. It's competitive for sure. And we're also racing with TV. And I don't even know exactly what your schedule is. Bianca should be up here too talking about this. But we are trying to plan often a more analytical kind of story, less the incremental, here's what happened and what the vote was kind of story, because we are pitching print stories for 8 days away. So it's sometimes, we might be writing the same story in a sense that the Herald just did or the Californian just did, but we are aiming to add to it, provide more context, do something a little bit different. And I also think there's a lot of value in having more outlets competing for the same story, because it drives us to all take it a little bit further and get it a little bit better. And also, we don't always have the same analysis of things. The Weekly did a very different analysis than KSDW did of the city of Salinas' decision to sue Donald Trump over sanctuary city federal funding withholding threats. And I think that's important. I think it's of value to our community to hear both of those impressions rather than us just repeat what another outlet said.
I agree with Sarah on several points. I like competition. Actually, and I believe cities and municipalities should have more than one news outlet. It does keep us on our toes, and we each bring something unique. I mean, for the Californian, our primary focus is on Salinas. It is not necessarily on the peninsula and so forth. So we do focus primarily on that now. If there's issues, or the city council or the planning commission, anything Salinas related, we do. So in terms of picking up Herald stories, I think they're looking maybe more at the peninsula. But yeah, there are some stories like the immigration story that's huge, and at the city council meeting, every news outlet is there. That's great. I think, like I said, every competition is good. I wish there were more of us. I think that there is, unfortunately, a shrinking cohort here in the Central Coast of journalists. I wish that there were more publications, competing publications in Salinas itself. I wish we had a competitive paper out there covering Salinas. So those would be my words. Also, the Californian is very unique now. We are a hybrid, actually, in many ways. We publish 3 days a week, and we publish on Wednesdays, Fridays, and the weekend section. But really, it's digital that we're focused on now. A lot of the readers, most of them, we're finding are shifting towards using mobile devices to read their news. They're looking at the email every morning and saying the 5 top stories of the day from the Californian. They're clicking into the headline and maybe reading the paragraph. We like them to read more, but that's the trend of the readership now. It's not just maybe for the Californian, but for readers in general. Mobile devices, the smartphone. It's like I get panicked if my smartphone's gone. It's the way of the world. So our readership is increasingly shifting through digital and not necessarily through print.
Any more questions? Surely there has to be another question. Okay, here's one.
Hi, my name is Helen Lofton. First of all, I'd like to compliment the Weekly. I think you're a great publication, and over the years that I've been here, I've just really seen it improve dramatically. It's a good source of news. So my question is, we mentioned earlier about the problem of, if the reporters have to cover every distraction bomb that Trump throws out there, like eating dogs or whatever it might be, then the readership has to be more educated in their consumption of the news. So do you have any ideas for how we educate the readership? As a retired educator, I'd like to know if you have any ideas on what we do, what could be done in the schools or through parenting to educate future generations as far as their news consumption goes, and telling fact from alternative fact, and sussing out what's important and what isn't.
I'll answer that first. I do want to amplify something she was saying on the weekly. We all sort of owe our gratitude to the weekly for picking up the slack to the degree they have. It used to be the Herald was the primary, but the Herald has struggled with resources more than other local papers. The weekly has really picked it up and it's become really kind of a dominant local news source in the peninsula. And they found one thing that they backed away from, which I was pleased to see, they stopped. The previous editor was kind of really into constant reports more, and they were doing a lot of breaking news, a lot of crime stuff. They kind of got away from that, which I'm pleased to see because it was kind of a waste of time. I like constant reports stuff. I think they've done a wonderful job of being both, the weekly supplement and the daily breaking news publications. To her question, the only thing I can think of, and I don't have a good answer for it, the only thing I can think of is to teach people when you're looking at social media, don't click on the things that say, see how so-and-so destroy Obama in 20 seconds. Learn to recognize the clickbait, and just to help people understand they're making money off you clicking on that. Don't click on the nonsense. That's as good as I can do. Sorry.
I have to say that I understand that there are some places, enlightened places, that are teaching media literacy in the high school level. And I think that is a trend that really needs to be encouraged. So wherever your public high school system is, tell them that that's really something vital. Public pressure would help a lot.
I think locally, I would agree with that, as journalists, professional journalists, we should go into the local high schools and the colleges, CSUMB, Hartnell, and talk to the classes and tell them of what we do, and maybe from that, share more about media literacy. I'm a huge proponent of that. There's a big national project called the News Literacy Project based out of Washington, D.C. They're also here in California. They have a huge network of high schools and journalists. So any journalist professional journalist who wants to sign up and go talk to a high school, be a guest speaker or lecturer is welcome. I think it starts from that level because I myself started in high school journalism. We had a newspaper back then. So I think media literacy should somehow be interwoven into the curriculum somehow.
Thanks. Well, I think we have time for one more question because I have a lot of thank yous. It's going to take some time. Yes.
We haven't really talked very much about the impact of who owns the media, the impact of ownership of the media on what is covered and how it's covered, the impact of ownership of media on the editorial, the editors' choices, and for me, I think it's huge. I was really shocked at how much bias I saw in reporting, even on TV, in the newspapers and so forth during this past election. I expected much more neutrality on the part of certain reporters than I saw, and I actually stopped following a lot of programs on TV and even reading that normally I would follow because I just felt like it was the same old stuff churning, and this is both on the left and the right. So here's my question.
Anybody want to talk about that?
Well, locally, it's probably not as much of an issue as you might think. I mean, I'll talk about the Herald. When the Herald got purchased by the current ownership is, let me go back a couple ownerships. When I first started the Herald, it was owned by Knight Ritter, and then it went to Media News, a fellow named Dean Lesher from East Bay. And the rumor was, and Dean's quite conservative, the rumor was that all the media newspapers, about 80 of the country, had endorsed George Bush the previous year. And so people, editorial page editors like me, looked everywhere and they did a quick search and found it wasn't, we were delighted to find it wasn't true. It was about half and half. for local papers, and that's really all I'm both going to talk about. Local papers, it really doesn't make that much difference because as long as the checks are going to headquarters, they don't give a rip what goes in the paper, what the quality is, what the editorial slant, they don't care. They just flat out do not care as long as somebody locally is sending a check to corporate.
We're pretty unusual at the Weekly in that even among our breed of, our category of alternative news weeklies, in that we are owned by a local person who started the newspaper, I should know this exactly, was it 29 years ago? Heather, do you know? 29 years ago. It feels like just yesterday we did a 25th anniversary issue, but I know it's time to start thinking about the 30th anniversary issue probably. And he is invested in this community and lives in this community too. And he pitches story ideas like everybody else, but he's not part of the newsroom. So sometimes I disagree, and sometimes we don't write about his story ideas. He's part of the editorial board, and there are a bunch of us on the editorial board, and we don't always agree, and we deliberate, and we all have an equal stake. Maybe some of us are an equal vote. We might have different powers of persuasion, but it's a pretty democratic process and a very free process. We don't have those kinds of corporate pressures. And certainly we are free to piss off our advertisers, and we sometimes do, and we have an extraordinary sales team, and a lot of them have been at the paper for many, many years, and they go do an extraordinary job of winning back the hearts and dollars of some of our advertisers, and they in a way have the hardest job because they have those relationships, and then we keep writing what we write.
Well, I think it's extremely important to look at ownership, actually, political economy of that as well. And I've worked at a variety of publications, some of them family-owned. I worked in China and Hong Kong for 6 years and saw the importance of ownership. The South China Morning Post that I was working for, the publisher was a member of the National Communist Party. So, there is self-censorship that exists overseas. The current publication, the Salinas, California, we're the oldest paper in California, so we're like historical as well. And it is owned by Gannett, which owns at least 120 newspapers, including USA Today. Recently, we were rebranded about maybe a year and a half ago as the USA Today Network. Now, I do see advantages to each of these different structures and maybe some disadvantages. Currently, when it was rebranded, we actually, as part of the network, have a greater reach when it comes to our stories now. A Salinas story that we have is often picked up through the USA Today network and goes and is published maybe in one of the other California papers, or even in USA Today. I've actually found that it's really helped with sourcing. I found that more people kind of wanting to talk because it expands the network of reach when it goes online or when it goes to different publications. I myself have not found that I've been censored because of the ownership or anything. In fact, I think because we're a local, publication, and we're kind of small, here in this area. I've been actually allowed to do lots of innovative things, such as do enterprise stories with a grant or do joint projects. So I really kind of found a lot of freedom in that through my experience, at least.
And I will point out that, as you probably know, the Wall Street Journal is a Murdoch paper. I've always found the editorial and the news coverage to be very distinctly different. The news coverage being pretty excellent and the editorials being pretty horrible. And one day that might merge soon. Well, I think we've come to the end of our evening. I have a lot of thank yous. And my first thank yous go to my excellent panel. I'd like to thank you all for listening. Really busy people, and I really appreciate you being here tonight. Of course, the Democratic Women of Monterey County, I'd like you to give them a big thank you. Aaron for putting in the time and effort. And we have Aaron Cobb over here who's making a masterpiece of and Eugene, of course. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. I hope you found this worthwhile. I'm sure that you could get some of our panels to hang around for a few minutes if you still want to grill them. But in any case, thank you for coming.
I just have a few minutes to say, a few things to say before we leave. Again, thank you to all. First of all, I wanted to welcome Supervisor Mary Adams. I didn't mean to neglect you, District 5, so thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to get us. And I try to keep my day job separate from my political activities, but since it came up, Laura, you mentioned it, I actually am the executive director for Meals on Wheels of the Salinas Valley. So we're a little concerned about what might be coming down the line as far as the budget. Aaron, would you like to say a few words about any of our political alerts coming up? I know it's 8:30 and folks probably need to go home and get ready to go to school in the morning. So
we'll let you go, but if you were inspired by what you heard here tonight, there are sheets of paper floating around that have a couple of suggestions for things that you can do, actions you can take. I think we're all looking for that now. There's a lot going on. We want to do concrete things. You can certainly support your local media if you already subscribe, like many of you do. Consider contributing to a scholarship fund. You'll see when you put your vacation hold on for the paper, it often asks you if you want to contribute those papers to local students or a fund. Do that. Let's get more people engaged with the media. Donate to your public media. They're going to need the funding. It's getting cut, and we want this diversity of different sources. And look for credible sources, both in our local community and online. We have one suggestion in our forums, but there are diversity out there. Let's all share with each other. So please contribute on social media with our community here. You can find us at DWMC.com and you can .org. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're out there.
all right, thank you. And just keep in mind, for those of you who are not familiar with the Democratic Women of Monterey County, we have a monthly luncheon. We're trying to do more outreach to reach people who are not able to come to our luncheons. But our next luncheon is on Thursday, April 20th, and the topic is going to be avoiding nuclear catastrophe. And when we worked on these programs, who knew that they would be so topical? Anyway, thank you all again, and of course, thank you to our incredible panel and Susan for moderating. Thank you all again for coming out on Thursday evening.